Have you ever taken a wrong turn and ended up somewhere that shouldn't exist? One evening, while wandering alone through the mountains, I lost my way on a narrow path. At first, I thought nothing of it. The sun was setting, the air was growing cool, and I assumed I would soon find my way back. But as I descended a steep slope, I saw a town lying quietly in the valley below. It seemed ordinary enough. Rows of houses stood along winding streets. Warm lights glowed behind windows. A few figures moved through the fading twilight. Yet something about the place felt deeply unsettling. The people walked strangely. The shadows lingered too long. And everywhere I looked, I sensed unseen eyes watching me from doorways, rooftops, and darkened alleys. Then a terrible realization began to take shape. This was no ordinary town. The inhabitants were not quite human. And somehow, without knowing it, I had crossed an invisible boundary into a place that belonged to cats. A hidden town that exists between dream and reality. A town few people have ever seen, and fewer still have escaped. Tonight, we enter Cat Town, one of the most haunting and unforgettable tales by the Japanese poet and writer Hagiwara Sakutaro. Chapter 1. Twilight on the Mountain Path. In those days, I often wandered alone. Whenever I found myself restless or burdened by thoughts I could not put into words, I would leave the crowded streets behind and walk into the hills outside the city. Solitude seemed easier to bear among trees and open skies than among people. One autumn evening, I set out as I had done many times before. The day had been clear and mild. Thin clouds drifted lazily across the sky, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of dry grass and fallen leaves. There was nothing unusual about the afternoon, and I expected nothing more than a quiet walk before returning home. Without paying much attention to my direction, I followed a narrow trail that wound higher into the mountains. At first, the path was familiar. I recognized the shape of the ridges, the clusters of pine trees, and the occasional rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. The scenery was comforting in its familiarity, and I walked on without concern. As the hours passed, however, the trail became less recognizable. The path forked several times, and I chose each turn almost absent-mindedly. My thoughts drifted elsewhere. I was so occupied with my own reflections that I scarcely noticed how far I had traveled. By the time I looked around carefully, the landscape had changed. The mountain slopes seemed unfamiliar. The trees grew denser. The trail beneath my feet had narrowed into little more than a rough track. I stopped and turned in a slow circle. For a moment, I could not determine which direction I had come from. A faint uneasiness stirred within me. Still, I was not particularly alarmed. I had lost my way before during country walks. Usually, all it took was a little patience to find a familiar landmark and regain my bearings. I continued forward. The sun was already sinking toward the western horizon. Long shadows stretched across the mountainside. The golden light of late afternoon deepened into copper and crimson. Above the distant peaks, the sky glowed with the last warmth of the day. It was beautiful. Yet as darkness gradually approached, the beauty of the landscape took on a strangely lonely character. The mountains seemed larger than before. The silence seemed deeper. Even the wind sounded different. Now and then I heard leaves rustling somewhere beyond the trees, though I could not tell what had disturbed them. Several times I paused and listened. Nothing followed. Only silence. The kind of silence that makes a person suddenly aware of how alone he truly is. I walked on. The trail began descending along the side of a steep slope. Below me lay a narrow valley, hidden between the mountains. At first, I noticed nothing unusual. Then, through the gathering dusk, I thought I saw something in the distance. A roof, then another, and another. I stopped. Far below, nestled in the valley where no town should have been, stood a cluster of buildings. At that distance, it was impossible to make out details. Yet there was no mistaking what I saw. It was a town, a complete town, resting quietly between the mountains. Warm lights had begun to appear in its windows. Thin trails of smoke rose into the evening air. The sight should have comforted me. After all, finding a settlement meant finding directions, shelter, and a road home. Yet for reasons I could not explain, I felt an unexpected hesitation. The town seemed strangely isolated, almost hidden, as though it existed apart from the ordinary world. I remained where I was for several moments, staring into the valley. The last light of day faded from the sky. One by one, the town's lights flickered to life, tiny golden points glowing in the deepening blue of twilight. A curious feeling came over me. Not fear. Not yet. Something closer to fascination. The kind of feeling one experiences when standing at the edge of a dream. Without fully understanding why, I left the mountain path and began making my way down toward the town below. And so, with the coming of night, I took my first steps toward the place that would later haunt my memory for the rest of my life. Chapter 2. The Town in the Valley. The descent took longer than I expected. The slope was steeper than it had appeared from above, and by the time I reached the valley floor, twilight had surrendered almost completely to night. A pale glow lingered in the western sky, but the mountains already stood as dark silhouettes against the fading light. As I approached the town, the sense of uneasiness I had felt on the mountainside returned. From a distance, the place had seemed ordinary. Up close, however, it possessed a peculiar atmosphere that I found difficult to describe. The streets were narrow and winding, curving between rows of wooden houses built close together. Warm light spilled from windows and doorways. Here and there, lanterns hung outside small shops, casting soft circles of amber light onto the road. Everything appeared peaceful, and yet everything felt slightly wrong. I entered the town through a quiet street lined with modest homes. People were out walking despite the late hour. Some carried baskets. Others stood speaking to neighbors near their front gates. At first glance, they seemed perfectly normal. But whenever I looked directly at them, an odd sensation crept over me. Their movements appeared unusually fluid. Their posture seemed strangely light. Several of them walked with a softness that reminded me less of people than of animals moving cautiously through unfamiliar territory. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, I had been wandering alone for hours. Fatigue and darkness could easily distort one's perceptions. Still, the feeling would not disappear. As I continued through the streets, I became aware of another strange detail. People kept glancing at me. Not openly, not rude. Rather, they watched me from the corners of their eyes. A shopkeeper paused while arranging merchandise outside his door. An elderly woman stopped sweeping her front step. Children peered around a corner before quickly disappearing from view. Each encounter lasted only a moment. Yet together, they created the uncomfortable impression that I was being quietly observed, like an intruder who had wandered into a gathering to which he had never been invited. The deeper I ventured into the town, the stronger that impression became. There was nothing threatening about the inhabitants. No one confronted me. No one spoke harshly. In fact, most people seemed determined to ignore me altogether. And somehow, that felt even stranger. The town itself seemed caught between familiarity and dream. Certain streets looked as though they belonged to a place I had known long ago. Occasionally, I would turn a corner and feel a sudden certainty that I had walked there before. But the feeling vanished the moment I tried to identify the memory. It was like chasing a half-forgotten dream upon waking. The harder I reached for it, the farther it slipped away. I wandered aimlessly through the maze of streets. The town seemed larger than it had appeared from the mountainside. Every lane led to another. Every intersection opened onto unfamiliar roads. Several times I attempted to retrace my steps, only to discover that the route behind me no longer looked the same. The houses appeared slightly different. The angles of the streets seemed altered. It was as though the town quietly rearranged itself whenever I stopped paying attention. At length, I arrived at a small square near the center of town. A few people sat outside a tea house, talking softly beneath hanging lanterns. Their conversation drifted through the cool night air. I could hear the rhythm of their voices. Yet strangely, I could not understand a single word. The language sounded familiar, not foreign, not incomprehensible, and yet the meaning remained just beyond my grasp, as though some invisible barrier prevented the words from reaching my understanding. The realization sent a chill through me. For the first time since entering the town, I felt genuinely lost. I looked around the square. The people continued their conversations. The lanterns swayed gently. A distant bell rang somewhere beyond the rooftops. And then I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Several figures sitting beneath the lantern light had turned toward me at the exact same moment. Their faces were calm, expressionless, watching, not with hostility, not with curiosity, but with the quiet awareness one might show upon discovering a stranger in a place where strangers do not belong. The square suddenly felt very still. I lowered my eyes and continued walking. No one followed. No one called after me. Yet I could not shake the feeling that every step I took was being measured by unseen eyes. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, a cat let out a long, mournful cry. The sound echoed through the narrow streets. Another answered, then another. Soon the town seemed alive with distant feline voices. They came from rooftops, from alleyways, from hidden gardens behind walls. A chorus of unseen creatures calling to one another across the sleeping town. I stopped and listened. The cries rose and fell like a secret language, and for a brief moment, an impossible thought crossed my mind. It felt less as though cats lived in this town, and more as though the town itself belonged to them. I quickly dismissed the idea. Yet as I resumed my wandering through the labyrinth of streets, that strange thought refused to leave me. And somewhere deep within the growing darkness, the first hint of the town's true nature began to reveal itself. Chapter 3. The Town of Cats. By now, the entire town seemed suspended in a strange and uncertain state, somewhere between reality and dream. I had long since abandoned any attempt to find my way back to the mountain path. Every street appeared to lead deeper into the settlement, and each turn revealed new alleys, courtyards, and narrow passages that seemed untouched by the ordinary world. The farther I wandered, the more peculiar my surroundings became. At first, the changes were subtle. A man crossing the street moved with an unusual grace, his shoulders low and relaxed, his footsteps almost soundless against the ground. A woman sitting beside a window tilted her head in a curious manner as I passed, studying me with an intensity that felt strangely familiar. Children chased one another through an alleyway, darting between shadows with astonishing agility. Individually, none of these things seemed remarkable. Together, however, they formed a pattern. A pattern I could sense long before I fully understood it. The realization came gradually. Not as a sudden revelation, but as a feeling that grew stronger with every passing moment. There was something unmistakably feline about the inhabitants of the town. The way they moved, the way they watched, the way they occupied space. Again and again, I caught myself thinking of cats, and each time I immediately dismissed the thought as absurd. Yet the comparison continued to return. I passed beneath a row of lanterns hanging over a narrow lane. A group of townspeople stood talking nearby. As I glanced toward them, one of the figures turned his head. For an instant, only an instant, I thought I saw pointed ears silhouetted against the light. I stopped. The figure blinked. The illusion vanished. Before me stood an ordinary man, or so it seemed. I continued walking, but my heartbeat had quickened. The town no longer felt merely strange. It felt unstable, as though its true appearance existed just beyond the limits of my perception. Every object seemed to possess two forms. The form I saw, and another form hidden beneath it. A form my mind struggled to comprehend. The streets grew quieter as the night deepened. The voices of the townspeople faded. Only the occasional cry of a distant cat broke the silence. Yet even those sounds had changed. The calls no longer seemed separate from the town itself. They flowed through the streets like a hidden current, connecting rooftops, windows, gardens, and darkened alleyways into a single living organism. I began noticing cats everywhere. They sat atop walls, curled beneath market stalls, watched from windows, balanced along rooftops high above the street. Some stared openly as I passed. Others vanished into darkness the moment I looked their way. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, far more than any ordinary town could reasonably contain. And still, no one appeared to notice them. The townspeople walked past without acknowledgement, as though the animals were neither unusual nor worthy of attention. That was when a disturbing possibility entered my mind. What if I had misunderstood everything? What if the cats were not merely inhabitants of the town? What if they were the town? The thought lingered, growing stronger, more difficult to dismiss. As I crossed another quiet street, I happened to glance into the brightly lit window of a small house. Inside, a family sat gathered around a table. A perfectly ordinary scene. A father, a mother, a child. For a moment, I looked away. Then something compelled me to look back. And this time, I saw them differently. The illusion lasted no more than a heartbeat. Yet it was enough. The father appeared covered in sleek gray fur. The mother's eyes reflected the lamplight with an uncanny brightness. The child possessed a long tail curled around the chair. Then the vision vanished. Once again, they were human. Perfectly human. I staggered backward. My breath caught in my throat. The house remained unchanged. The family continued their meal, unaware of my presence. Had I imagined it? Exhaustion could explain many things. Darkness could explain many more. But deep within myself, I knew the answer was not so simple. The boundary between appearances and reality was beginning to dissolve. I walked on. Everywhere I looked, the same phenomenon repeated itself. Faces flickered between human and feline. Movements became fluid, predatory, graceful. Eyes glimmered strangely in the darkness. The town seemed to shift continuously between two worlds. One visible, one concealed, and somehow I had begun to perceive both. Fear should have driven me away, yet I found myself increasingly fascinated. The revelation possessed a dreamlike beauty. There was nothing monstrous about these beings, nothing cruel, nothing threatening. If anything, they appeared completely at home in their hidden existence. It was I who did not belong, I who stood outside the natural order of this place. For the first time, I understood the glances that had followed me through the streets, the silent observations, the cautious curiosity, the feeling of being watched. The townspeople had recognized me immediately, just as a colony of cats would instantly notice the arrival of an unfamiliar animal. I was the stranger, the intruder, the creature who had crossed a boundary he was never meant to cross. A cold wind drifted through the narrow street. Somewhere above, a chorus of cats began calling to one another. The cries echoed across rooftops and chimneys beneath the pale moonlight. I lifted my eyes toward the darkened skyline, and there, silhouetted against the night sky, countless feline shapes sat watching over the town, silent, patient, as though they had been waiting for me to finally understand where I was. Only then did I accept the truth. I had wandered into a town hidden from ordinary human sight, a town that existed beside our world, yet apart from it, a town whose true inhabitants wore human faces only as a disguise, a town that belonged entirely to cats. Chapter 4. Beyond the boundary. Once I accepted the truth, the town no longer seemed quite as impossible. The shock had passed. In its place came a strange sense of clarity. I had spent the evening trying to explain away what I was seeing. Fatigue, darkness, imagination. Each had offered a convenient answer. Yet none of them could account for the countless details that surrounded me. This was Cat Town. Whether it existed in the physical world or only beside it no longer seemed important. What mattered was that I was here. And somehow, I had crossed into a place where different rules applied. The night deepened as I continued walking. Moonlight spilled across rooftops and narrow streets. The town had grown quieter, but it did not feel asleep. Rather, it felt alert, like a living creature resting with its eyes half open. The streets twisted through the valley in ways that often left me disoriented. Several times I have found myself returning to places I thought I had already passed. A small square, a stone bridge, a narrow alley lined with wooden fences. Yet each time they appeared slightly different. A doorway stood where none had been before. A lantern burned in a different window. A familiar corner opened onto an unfamiliar street. The town seemed unwilling to remain fixed. As I wandered, I became increasingly aware of the cats themselves. They were no longer hidden among the shadows. Moonlight revealed them everywhere. Cats rested atop walls, warmed by the day's fading heat. They watched from rooftops overlooking the streets below. They sat in windows like silent guardians. Some appeared sleek and young. Others looked ancient, their faces marked by years of experience. Yet all of them shared the same calm, watchful gaze. Not once did I see two cats fighting. Not once did I hear the chaotic noises common to ordinary strays. Instead, they existed with an unusual sense of order, as though each animal understood its place within a larger design. The feeling unsettled me. The town no longer seemed inhabited by cats. It seemed governed by them. I crossed a small bridge spanning a narrow stream. The water reflected the moonlight like polished silver. For a moment, I paused to look down. The reflection trembled gently, and in that reflection I thought I saw the truth more clearly than ever before. The figures moving through the streets appeared human. Yet beneath their reflections moved graceful, feline forms. Cats walking where people walked. Cats gathering where people gathered. Cats living lives hidden beneath another appearance. I blinked. The vision vanished. Only rippling water remained. Still, the image lingered in my mind. The boundary between the two worlds was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. I continued upward along a winding road that climbed toward the edge of town. From there I could see much of the valley below. Lanterns glowed softly among the clustered rooftops. The mountains surrounded the settlement on every side. There were no visible roads leading in, no signs pointing the way. From above, the town seemed completely isolated from the ordinary world, as though it existed in a forgotten corner of reality, a place reached only by accident, a place one could enter but never deliberately find. The realization filled me with an unexpected melancholy. I knew then that I could never belong here. The inhabitants moved through their hidden world with perfect ease. I alone remained an outsider, a traveler who had stepped through a door that was never meant for him. The cats watching from the rooftops seemed to understand this. Their eyes followed me without hostility, without welcome, without judgment. They simply watched, patient and silent, as though waiting for something. Perhaps they were waiting for me to leave. Perhaps they already knew that my time in their town was drawing to a close. A cold breeze drifted down from the mountains. Clouds passed briefly across the moon. For an instant, the valley darkened. And when the light returned, the town appeared strangely distant. Not physically distant, but fragile, uncertain. Like a dream that lingers only moments before waking. A faint uneasiness stirred within me. For the first time that night, I felt that the town was slipping away. The hidden world I had entered was beginning to withdraw from me. And somewhere deep inside, I sensed that the boundary I had crossed would not remain open much longer. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Town. A feeling of urgency came over me. Until that moment, I had drifted through the town as though moving through a dream, allowing its strange currents to carry me wherever they pleased. But now, standing upon the hill and watching the world around me grow uncertain, I felt a sudden and overwhelming need to leave. The town was fading, or perhaps I was. Either way, something was ending. I descended the stone path as quickly as I could. The cats remained behind. None followed. None attempted to stop me. Yet I could still feel their eyes upon my back as I hurried downward through the moonlit streets. At first, the town appeared unchanged. The houses still stood where they had before. Lanterns continued to glow beside doors and windows. The narrow roads twisted between familiar walls. But as I moved through them, small details began to shift. A street I clearly remembered seemed shorter than before. A row of houses disappeared when I glanced away and looked back again. An alley that had once stretched into darkness now ended abruptly at a stone wall. The town was unraveling. Its shape no longer held together. Like a dream dissolving beneath the light of morning, its pieces were quietly slipping away. I quickened my pace. The farther I went, the more unstable everything became. Buildings seemed transparent at their edges. Shadows drifted where no object cast them. Entire corners of the town appeared submerged in a faint silver mist, Once, I turned to look behind me and found that the street I had just crossed was gone. In its place stood an empty slope, covered with grass and scattered rocks. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked. The slope remained. The street had vanished completely. For the first time since entering the valley, genuine fear seized me. I was no longer certain where the town ended and the mountains began. I was no longer certain where reality itself began. The night wind rose around me. The distant cries of cats echoed across the valley. Yet even those sounds seemed farther away now. Fainter, as though they belonged to another world. I continued forward. At times, I stumbled. At times, I found myself standing in places I could not remember reaching. The landscape changed with every step. Houses became shadows. Shadows became trees. Streets became footpaths. And still I walked. The moon disappeared behind clouds. Darkness deepened. For a while, I believed I was completely lost. Then, through the confusion, I noticed something familiar. A narrow mountain trail. Simple. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The sight filled me with relief. It was the first thing I'd seen all night that seemed entirely real. Without hesitation, I followed it. The path climbed steadily upward. Behind me, the valley lay silent. I resisted the urge to look back. Some instinct warned me not to, as though turning around might somehow trap me within the fading dream forever. So I kept my eyes fixed on the trail ahead. One step, then another. The climb seemed endless. Yet gradually, the world began to feel solid again. The air grew colder. The scent of pine returned. The earth beneath my feet felt firm and familiar. Little by little, the strange atmosphere that had surrounded the town released its hold upon me. At last, unable to resist any longer, I stopped. Slowly I turned around. The valley below lay beneath the moonlight. Quiet. Empty. I stared in disbelief. The town was gone. No lanterns glowed among the hills. No rooftops clustered beneath the mountains. No winding streets cut through the darkness. There was nothing. Only forest, rocky slopes, and the pale silver light of the moon. I remained there for several minutes, unable to move. The valley appeared exactly as any ordinary valley should. No sign remained of the place I had wandered through. No evidence remained of its inhabitants. No trace remained of Cat Town. Had it ever existed at all? The question echoed through my mind. Perhaps exhaustion had deceived me. Perhaps I had dreamed the entire experience while lost among the mountains. Such explanations would have been comforting, reasonable, yet I could not accept them. The memories were too vivid, too detailed, too real. I remembered the winding streets, the silent observers, the rooftops crowded with watching cats, the strange feeling of crossing an invisible boundary into a hidden world. No dream had ever possessed such clarity. The wind stirred the trees around me. Somewhere far below, carried faintly across the mountains, I thought I heard the cry of a cat. Just one, a single distant voice. Then silence. I listened for another call. None came. The valley remained still, and at last, with dawn slowly approaching beyond the eastern peaks, I turned away and continued down the mountain toward the world of ordinary men. Chapter 6. The Memory of Cat Town. Many years have passed since that night. The mountains remain where they have always been. The valleys still lie between them. Seasons come and go, leaves fall and return, and the world continues its quiet passage through time. Yet I have never forgotten what happened. Even now, the memory remains as vivid as the moonlight that illuminated those strange streets. From time to time, I have attempted to find the place again. On several occasions, I returned to the mountains where my journey began. I followed old trails. I explored forgotten paths. I searched valleys hidden between ridges and walked roads that few travelers seem to use. But I never found it. The valley was always empty. There were forests. There were rocks. There were streams winding through the hills. But there was no town. No lanterns. No narrow streets. No silent inhabitants watching from the shadows. Nothing. The place I remembered so clearly had vanished from the world as completely as a dream. And yet, I cannot believe it was merely a dream. There are moments, even now, when I catch sight of something that brings the memory rushing back. A cat sitting motionless on a stone wall. A pair of eyes gleaming from a dark alley. A narrow street glimpsed unexpectedly at dusk. Such things awaken a feeling I cannot easily explain. For an instant, the boundary between memory and reality grows thin, and I find myself wondering whether Cat Town still exists somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary sight. Perhaps it was never a place that could be found intentionally. Perhaps it reveals itself only to those who wander far enough from familiar roads. Or perhaps it belongs to another order of existence entirely. A world that touches our own only briefly, in rare and accidental moments. I do not know. What I do know is this. On that evening, I crossed a boundary. Not a physical boundary marked by walls or gates, but something far more mysterious. A boundary that separates the known from the unknown, the visible from the hidden, the ordinary from the extraordinary. For a short time, I stepped beyond it. And for a short time, another world allowed me to enter. Sometimes I wonder whether the inhabitants of that town remember me, whether the silent figures I encountered still walk those winding streets beneath distant lanterns, whether the cats that watched me from rooftops still gather beneath the moon. The thought is strangely comforting, not because I wish to return. In truth, I am no longer certain that I could bear to. There was beauty in that hidden place, but there was also an unsettling sense of otherness, a reminder that the world contains mysteries that were never meant to be fully understood. Some doors, once opened, cannot truly be closed. Some places remain with us long after we leave them behind. Cat Town is such a place. Even now, when evening settles over the city and the last light fades from the sky, I occasionally hear a distant cat crying somewhere beyond the darkness. Whenever that happens, I pause and listen. And for a moment, I am once again standing on a mountain path at twilight. The valley lies below me. The air is cool. The world is quiet. And somewhere, hidden between dream and reality, a town of cats waits beneath the rising moon. A town that few people have ever seen. A town that most would never believe exists. Yet a town that I know with absolute certainty is real. Or at least, real enough. The end.